In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a shocking murder rocks the calm. Celebrated author Eliza Harcourt is found strangled in her attic, a silk scarf tied around her throat. Her explosive memoir, poised to unveil secrets of the literary world, has vanished. Enter Miss Jane Marple, a sharp-eyed spinster whose gentle demeanor hides a razor-sharp mind. As whispers swirl around a desperate publisher, an ambitious editor, an obsessed fan, and a greedy nephew, Miss Marple unravels a web of greed, betrayal, and hidden truths. With a scratched typewriter key, a navy thread, and a damning page as her clues, she exposes a killer who thought they'd silenced the truth forever. In 30 seconds, dive into a tale where no secret stays buried. Chapter 1. The Attic Discovery. The late summer sun cast a golden haze over St. Mary Mead, where the hedgerows bloomed with wild roses and the air carried the faint hum of bees. In her modest cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, her fingers deftly working a pair of knitting needles, the soft click-clack blending with the distant chime of the church clock striking 3. The village, with its thatched roofs and tidy gardens, seemed wrapped in a drowsy peace, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes, peering over her spectacles, missed nothing, not the postman's lingering chat with the baker's wife, nor the hurried step of young Dr. Haydock's assistant. She had long known that beneath the village's tranquil surface lay currents of human folly, as intricate as the lace pattern emerging from her wool. It was Cherry, her young maid, who broke the mornings. Bursting through the door with a tray of tea and a face flushed with news. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's dreadful," she gasped, nearly upsetting the teapot. "Mrs. Harcourt, Mrs. Eliza Harcourt, up at Rose Cottage, she's been found dead, in her attic, of all places, with a scarf round her throat." Cherry's voice quivered, her hands twisting her apron as she recounted the grim tale. Gleaned from the milkman who'd heard it from the constable's wife, Miss Marple set down her knitting, her expression calm but her mind already stirring. "Dead, you say? And with a scarf," she murmured, her tone as mild as if she were discussing the weather. "How very curious. Who found her?" "Cherry. The gardener, miss, old Mr. Timmins, who goes up to Rose Cottage twice a week. He saw the attic window open and thought it odd, so he climbed the stairs, and oh, it's too awful." Cherry shivered, pouring tea with a clatter. "They're saying she was strangled, Miss Marple, right there in her own home." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her thoughts darting like minnows. Mrs. Eliza Harcourt, the widow who'd moved to St. Mary Mead 5 years ago, was no ordinary villager. Her novels, penned under the name E.H. Arden, were the talk of drawing rooms and bookshops, their pages brimming with scandalous tales of high society, thinly disguised as fiction. Her sharp wit had won her admirers, but also enemies, for many suspected her characters were drawn from life. Rose Cottage, perched at the village's edge, with its ivy-clad walls and sloping garden, had become a place of mystery, its occupant rarely seen except at the post office or the occasional literary gathering. "A scarf," Miss Marple repeated, softly, her eyes narrowing. "Silk, I suppose, and no sign of a break-in." Cherry nodded vigorously. "That's what the milkman said. Inspector Crane's up there now, with his men, poking about. They say it's murder, plain as day." Miss Marple's lips pursed, a faint frown creasing her brow. Murder in St. Mary Mead was rare, but not unheard of, and she had a knack for unraveling such tangles. Her mind flicked to the attic, a queer place for a murder, so private, so intimate. It suggested someone Eliza knew, someone she'd allowed into her sanctuary. "I think," she said, rising with a sprightliness that belied her years, "I shall take a walk to the vicarage. Mrs. Clement may know more." The vicarage was abuzz when Miss Marple arrived, her black lace cap neat under her hat, her basket swinging lightly on her arm. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, was in a state, her cheeks pink, as she relayed the news to a cluster of village women. It's shocking, Miss Marple, she said, drawing her aside. Eliza Harcourt of all people? The inspector's been to see Leonard, her nephew, and there's talk of others, a publisher, an editor, even a fan who's been hanging about. The vicar thought you might. Well, you've a way with these things. Miss Marple demurred, her smile gentle, but her eyes bright with interest. I'm only an old woman, my dear, but I'll do what I can to help. She accepted a cup of tea and settled into a chair, listening as Mrs. Clement listed the suspects. Mr. Gerald Ramsay, Eliza's publisher, seen at the village inn with a sleek air of importance. Miss Clara Dunham, her editor, a brisk woman with ambitions beyond her station. Mr. Timothy Vale, a peculiar man who wrote Eliza fervent letters and followed her like a shadow. And Mr. Leonard Harcourt, her nephew, a charming but feckless young man who relied on his aunt's purse. Each, Miss Marple noted, had reason to visit Rose Cottage, and perhaps reason to wish its occupant harm as she walked home. Her steps slow along the cobbled lane, Miss Marple's mind turned to the scarf. A silk scarf was no common thing in a struggle. It was deliberate, personal, perhaps even symbolic. She recalled Eliza's last appearance at the village hall, reading from her latest novel, her voice sharp with irony as she described a betrayed heroine. Had Eliza's pen, so quick to expose others, finally provoked a fatal retaliation? Miss Marple reached her gate, her fingers brushing the roses, and resolved to learn more. People, she murmured to herself, are so very careless with their secrets. Chapter 2. The publishers visit the village of St. Mary Mead, with its drowsy charm and neatly trimmed hedges, seemed to hold its breath the morning after Mrs. Eliza Harcourt's grim discovery. The news of her strangulation in the attic of Rose Cottage had spread like wildfire through the lanes, igniting whispers in the grocer's shop, the post office, and the tea rooms. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her small parlor, with a cup of Earl Grey and her knitting needles clicking softly, felt the pulse of the village's unease. Her window, framed by lace curtains, offered a view of the high street, where villagers moved with a certain haste, their heads bent in murmured conferences. Murder, Miss Marple knew, had a way of stirring the quietest waters, and she was determined to sift through the ripples. It was mid-morning when she decided to take a stroll to the Blue Boar, the village inn where Mr. Gerald Ramsay, Eliza Harcourt's publisher, had taken lodging. Ramsay, a man whose name carried weight in London's literary circles, had arrived in St. Mary Mead the previous day, ostensibly to discuss Eliza's latest manuscript, a memoir. The rumors said that promised to lift the veil on the publishing world's darker corners. Miss Marple, ever attuned to the nuances of human behavior, found his timing curious. A publisher did not travel to a remote village for mere pleasantries, especially not one with Ramsay's reputation for ruthlessness and charm. The Blue Boar was a quaint establishment, its oak beams polished to a gleam, and its windows adorned with geraniums. As Miss Marple entered, her black-laced cap bobbing slightly, she was greeted by Mrs. Tuttle, the innkeeper's wife, whose round face was alight with the thrill of scandal. "Oh, Miss Marple, isn't it dreadful about poor Mrs. Harcourt?" she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "And to think Mr. Ramsay was here, bold as brass, the very night it happened. He's upstairs now, taking his breakfast late." Miss Marple smiled gently, her eyes twinkling with interest. "Mr. Ramsay, you say? I'd heard he was in the village. A business visit, I presume." Mrs. Tuttle leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "That's what he says, but I heard him last night, talking to young Sally at the bar. Something about a dangerous book that could ruin everything. He was proper worked up, miss, his face all red and his voice sharp. Sally said he drank 3 whiskeys before stomping off to his room." Miss Marple nodded, filing the information away like a card in her mental index. "How very interesting," she murmured. "I wonder if I might have a word with Sally, just To pass the time, you understand. Sally, the barmaid, was a rosy-cheeked girl of 20, with a quick tongue and a knack for overhearing what wasn't meant for her ears. Miss Marple found her polishing glasses behind the bar, her eyes darting nervously as the old lady approached. "Good morning, Sally," Miss Marple said, settling onto a stool with the air of one merely seeking a chat. "I hear you had quite a busy evening with our visitor, Mr. Ramsay. He must be a fascinating man, coming all the way from London." Sally hesitated, then leaned forward, her voice low. "He's a proper gent, Miss Marple, with his fine suit and gold cufflinks, but he's got a temper. Last night, he was on about Mrs. Harcourt's books, said it was full of lies that'd bring down good men, kept muttering about stopping it before it went too far. I didn't like the look in his eyes, miss. Cold, they were, like a snake's." Miss Marple's needles, tucked into her basket, seemed to click in her mind as she listened. A dangerous book, a man with a temper, and a murder, the very next day. Coincidence, perhaps, but she had learned to distrust coincidences. "Did he mention visiting Mrs. Harcourt?" she asked, her tone as mild as milk. "He said he'd been to Rose Cottage that afternoon," Sally replied, glancing over her shoulder. "Said they'd had a civil discussion, but he didn't look like a man who'd been civil. He left the bar around 9, said he was turning in, but I saw him later, walking down the lane toward the cottage. Must have been past 10. Miss Marple thanked Sally and made her way to a corner table, where she could observe the inn's comings and goings. The Blue Boar was lively today, with villagers dropping in to exchange theories about the murder. She overheard snippets that scarf was silk, you know, not something you'd find in the village shop. And they say the attic door was locked from the inside, but how's that possible? Her mind turned to the scarf, a detail that nagged at her like a dropped stitch. Silk, personal, deliberate, perhaps a gift, she thought, from someone Eliza trusted. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Ramsay himself, descending the stairs with the confidence of a man accustomed to command. He was 60, perhaps, with silver hair swept back from a high forehead and a suit tailored to perfection. His eyes, a piercing gray, scanned the room before settling on Miss Marple, whom he dismissed as a harmless spinster. "Good morning," he said, nodding politely, as he ordered coffee from Sally. "A sad business about Mrs. Harcourt, isn't it? The village must be quite shaken." "Indeed, Mr. Ramsay," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but her gaze sharp. "A terrible loss. I understand you knew her well, being her publisher. You must have come to discuss her latest work." Ramsay's smile was smooth, but his fingers tightened briefly on his cup. "Yes, her memoir. A challenging project, full of sensitive material. We met yesterday to iron out some details." She was in good spirits, I assure you. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of innocent curiosity. "How fortunate you could visit her in person. Rose Cottage is rather out of the way. I suppose you discussed the memoir's content." "I've heard it was quite revealing." Ramsay's smile faltered, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "Eliza had a vivid imagination," he said carefully. "Her memoir was more fiction than fact, I'm afraid. We were working to ensure it wouldn't cause unnecessary distress." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes never leaving his. "Of course. A publisher must protect his authors and his business. I imagine a book like that could stir up trouble in certain circles." Ramsay laughed, a touch too heartily. "You're quite perceptive, Miss Marple," she supplied, her smile disarming. "Just an old lady, with too much time to think. I do hope the police find whoever did this dreadful thing. It's so unsettling, don't you think, to know someone was in that attic with her?" Ramsay's jaw tightened, but he recovered quickly. "Indeed, I've told Inspector Crane all I know. I was back here by 9, as Sally can confirm. A tragic business, but I'm sure the truth will come out." He excused himself, citing a need to prepare for a meeting, and left the inn with a brisk step. Miss Marple remained, sipping her tea, her mind weaving through the threads of what she'd learned. Ramsay's charm was polished, but beneath it lay a tension. She recognized the strain of a man with something to hide. His claim of returning by 9 contradicted Sally's sighting of him near Rose Cottage at 10, and the memoir, with its sensitive material, suggested a motive as clear as the church bell's chime. She recalled a similar case in St. Mary, Mead years ago, when a businessman had silenced a partner to protect his profits. Greed, she knew, could drive even the most polished violence. Determined to see the crime scene, Miss Marple made her way to Rose Cottage, where Inspector Crane, a tall man with a methodical air, was overseeing his constables. He greeted her with a mix of respect and exasperation, for Miss Marple's reputation for solving mysteries had reached even the county police. "Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat. "Mrs. Clement said you might lend a hand. I warn you, it's a grim sight." The cottage was as charming as ever, its garden bursting with late roses, but an air of desolation hung about it. Inside, the stairs creaked as Miss Marple followed Crane to the attic. A low-ceilinged room cluttered with books, papers, and a typewriter perched on a worn desk. The silk scarf, a soft blue with a subtle monogram, lay coiled in an evidence bag. Crane pointed to the floor, where chalk marked the spot where Elisa had been found, her body crumpled near the desk. "No sign of a struggle," he said, "except for a few papers scattered." The door was locked, but the key was inside. Whoever did this knew their way around. Miss Marple's eyes roamed the room, taking in the details: the open window, letting in a breeze that stirred the curtains; the typewriter, its keys gleaming, except for one with a faint scratch; the absence of the memoir's manuscript, though a single page peeked from beneath a blotter. She bent closer, her spectacles catching the light, and read a fragment. "A man who built his empire on others' work, his smile a mask for deceit." The words were damning, and Miss Marple's mind turned to Ramsay. "This scarf," she said, pointing to the evidence bag. "It's rather fine, isn't it? Not the sort of thing one buys casually." Crane nodded. Ramsay admitted it was a gift to Mrs. Harcourt, given last year. Said it was a token of appreciation, but why use it to kill her? That's what puzzles me. Miss Marple did not reply, but her thoughts were busy. A gift used as a weapon suggested a personal betrayal, a trust turned to malice. She recalled a young woman in the village, years ago, who had been strangled with her own shawl by a jealous suitor. The intimacy of the act was chilling, and here, in this attic, it spoke of someone who knew Eliza well perhaps too well. "The memoir," she said softly. "It's gone, I take it." "Vanished," Crane confirmed. "We found notes, but the bulk of it's missing." If it was the motive, the killer took it with them. Miss Marple thanked Crane and stepped into the garden, where the roses seemed to mock the tragedy within. She thought of Ramsay's sleek demeanor, his talk of a civil discussion, and Sally's account of his anger. A man facing ruin, she mused, might go to great lengths to protect his empire. The memoir, with its accusations of deceit, could topple Ramsay's house of cards, especially if his publishing firm was as shaky as village gossip suggested. She recalled Mrs. Tuttle's mention of Ramsay's debts, whispered by a traveling salesman who dined at the inn. A man in debt, with his reputation at stake, might see murder as a desperate solution. As she walked back to her cottage, her basket swinging lightly, Miss Marple's mind was a tapestry of clues: the scarf's monogram, the missing manuscript, Ramsay's late-night walk. She thought of her nephew Raymond, a writer himself, who'd once described publishers as sharks in silk suits. Ramsay, she suspected, was such a shark, and Eliza's memoir had been the bait that drew him to her attic. But suspicion was not proof, and Miss Marple knew the other suspects: Clara Dunham, Timothy Vale, Leonard Harcourt each held their own secrets. She would watch them all, her needles clicking as patiently as her thoughts, until the pattern, of truth emerged. Back in her parlor, she took up her knitting, the wool soft under her fingers. The village might buzz with fear, but Miss Marple felt only the quiet thrill of a puzzle. People, she said to herself, her eyes on the high street, are so very careless when they think they're safe. Chapter 3. The Editor's Ambition. The sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the village green, as Miss Jane Marple made her way to the guest house, where Miss Clara Dunham, Eliza Harcourt's editor, had taken up residence. The air was thick with the scent of cut grass and honeysuckle, but beneath the village's bucolic charm lay a restless undercurrent, stirred by the murder at Rose Cottage. Miss Marple, her black handbag tucked under her arm, walked with the unhurried gait of an elderly spinster, yet her mind was as sharp as the pins in her knitting basket. Clara Dunham, she had learned, was a woman of ambition, and ambition, as Miss Marple well knew, could be a dangerous spark in the tinder of human nature. The guest house, a neat brick building with ivy creeping up its walls, was run by Mrs. Leela Grayson, a widow whose knack for gossip rivaled even the postmistresses. Miss Marple found her sweeping the front steps, her eyes bright with the eagerness to share news. "Miss Marple, you've heard about poor Mrs. Harcourt, of course," Mrs. Grayson began, leaning on her broom. "And now that Miss Dunham's staying here, I can't help but wonder. She's a sharp one, that lady, always scribbling in her notebook and muttering about books. Came down from London 2 days ago, and she's been in and out ever since." Miss Marple smiled, her expression one of gentle curiosity. Miss Dunham must be dreadfully upset, losing an author like Mrs. Harcourt. I understand they worked closely together. "Oh, closely indeed," Mrs. Grayson said, lowering her voice, "but not always friendly, if you take my meaning. I overheard her on the telephone yesterday, talking to someone about taking control and making changes. Sounded like she had big plans. Miss Marple, and not all of them kind. Why, the night before the murder, she came back late, her coat all muddy, and burned some papers in the fireplace. I saw the ashes myself." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "Burned papers. How very curious. Perhaps she was tidying up. Editing is such a meticulous task, isn't it?" Mrs. Grayson snorted. "Tidy, my foot." She looked like she'd seen a ghost, all pale and jumpy. "And those papers thick, they were like a manuscript. I didn't like to pry, but it's odd, don't you think, with Mrs. Harcourt dead the next day?" Miss Marple nodded, her mind already weaving this new thread into the tapestry of clues. Burning papers suggested secrets, and secrets, in her experience, were often the prelude to crime. She thanked Mrs. Grayson and stepped into the guest house's small parlor, where Clara Dunham sat at a writing desk, her pen moving briskly over a notebook. Clara was a woman in her early 30s, with a severe bob of dark hair and a face that was handsome rather than pretty, its lines sharpened by determination. Her gray suit was impeccably tailored, but her fingers, twisting a silver ring, betrayed a nervous energy. "Good morning, Miss Dunham," Miss Marple said, settling into a chintz-covered chair with the air of one merely paying a social call. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I'm Jane Marple, a neighbor of sorts, come to offer my condolences about Mrs. Harcourt. Such a terrible loss." Clara looked up, her green eyes wary but polite. "Thank you, Miss Marple. It's a shock, of course. Eliza was a challenging author, but brilliant. I'm still trying to make sense of it." Her voice was crisp, with a trace of a London accent, and her pen tapped restlessly against the desk. Miss Marple tilted her head, her smile disarming. "You must have known her work intimately, being her editor." "I've heard her memoir was quite extraordinary. Did you have a chance to discuss it with her before?" Clara's pen stilled, and for a moment, her composure wavered. "We met the day before she died," she said carefully. "The memoir was difficult. Eliza had a habit of writing what she pleased, regardless of consequences. We argued about Some passages nothing unusual for an editor and author, but I left her in good health, I assure you." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes fixed on Clara's ring, which gleamed as it caught the light. Of course, editing must be such a delicate balance, guiding an author without stifling them. I imagine her memoir posed quite a challenge, with its revelations. Clara's lips tightened, and she set her pen down. It was bold, I'll grant you. Eliza didn't care whose feathers she ruffled, but that's what made her successful. My job was to polish her work, not censor it. Her tone was defensive, and Miss Marple noted the slight flush creeping up her neck. "I quite understand," Miss Marple said, her voice as soothing as a lullaby. "Though I've heard rumors village talk, you know that the memoir might have upset certain people. Mr. Ramsay, perhaps, or others in the publishing world." Clara's eyes narrowed, but she forced a smile. "Village talk is just that, talk. Gerald Ramsay's a professional. He knew Eliza's work stirred controversy. As for others, I wouldn't know. I focus on the manuscript, not the gossip." She stood, signaling the conversation's end. "If you'll excuse me, I have letters to write." Miss Marple rose, her manner unruffled. "Of course, my dear. I won't keep you, but do take care's tea. Mary Mead is a small place, and eyes are everywhere." She smiled, her words gentle but laced with a quiet warning, and left the parlor. Outside, Miss Marple paused by the guest house's garden, where marigolds nodded in the breeze. Clara's defensiveness, the burned papers, the muddy coat-hole pointed to a woman with something to conceal. Miss Marple recalled a young governess in the village, years ago, who had burned love letters to hide an affair, only to be undone by a single charred fragment. Clara, she suspected, was no lovesick girl, but her ambition was a fire that could burn just as fiercely. Mrs. Grayson's mention of taking control suggested Clara had plans beyond editing, perhaps, to seize Ramsay's faltering publishing house, as village gossip hinted. Eliza's memoir, with its potential to destabilize that house, might have threatened those plans. Determined to learn more, Miss Marple made her way to the church, where a weekly tea was underway. The village hall was abuzz with women, their voices a soft hum of speculation about the murder. Miss Marple slipped into a chair beside Mrs. Price, the baker's wife, whose sharp tongue was matched only by her keen memory. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Price said, passing a plate of scones, "you'll have heard about Miss Dunham, I suppose. Staying at Mrs. Grayson's, bold as you please, when everyone knows she and Mrs. Harcourt were at loggerheads." Miss Marple buttered a scone, her movements deliberate. "At loggerheads? How distressing. I thought editors and authors were allies." Mrs. Price leaned closer, her eyes gleaming. "Not those two. My cousin's girl, who cleans for Mrs. Grayson, heard them arguing at Rose Cottage last week. Miss Dunham was shouting about cutting the whole thing and Mrs. Harcourt saying she'd publish it as is, come what may. And now, look, Mrs. Harcourt's dead, and Miss Dunham's burning papers like she's got something to hide." Miss Marple's needles, though absent, seemed to click in her mind. "How very curious," she said. "And this argument, was it about the memoir, do you think?" "Bound to be," Mrs. Price replied. "Everyone knows that book was trouble. My cousin says Miss Dunham's been talking about starting her own publishing house, but she needs money, lots of it. They say Mr. Ramsay's firm is in trouble, and Miss Dunham's been cozying up to his investors. If that memoir brought him down, where would she get her chance?" Miss Marple sipped her tea, her thoughts racing. Clara's ambition was no mere rumor, then a woman with dreams of her own publishing empire might see Eliza's memoir as a double-edged sword capable of toppling Ramsay's firm, but also of ruining her own prospects if it exposed her as complicit in his schemes. "The burned papers," suggested Clara had seen the manuscript, perhaps even taken a copy. But why burn it? To hide her own secrets, or to protect someone else? As the tea ended, Miss Marple walked home, her steps slow along the cobbled lane. The village was settling into evening, the sky a soft lavender, but her mind was far from tranquil. Clara Dunham's nervous ring-twisting, her muddy coat. Her argument with Elizal painted a picture of a woman under pressure. Miss Marple thought of a young clerk she'd known, driven to theft by the promise of a better life. Ambition, she knew, could twist even the most disciplined mind into dangerous paths. Back in her cottage, she took up her knitting, the soft wool slipping through her fingers. The scarf, the memoir, the locked attic door, these were the knots she must unravel. Clara Dunham, with her sharp mind and sharper ambitions, was a thread in the pattern. But whether she was the killer or merely a witness remained to be seen. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the window, where the village lay quiet under the gathering dusk. People, she murmured, are so very good at hiding what they fear to face. Chapter 4. The fans' devotion. The morning mist clung to the lanes of St. Mary Mead, softening the outlines of the thatched cottages and lending an air of mystery to the village's quiet beauty. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a woolen shawl against the autumn chill, walked purposefully toward the post office, where Mr. Timothy Vale, Eliza Harcourt's most ardent admirer, had taken a room above the shop. The murder of the author in her attic at Rose Cottage had set tongues wagging, and Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for human frailty, sensed that Vale's devotion might hold a key to the puzzle. Her steps were measured, her black handbag swinging lightly, but her mind darted like a swallow, piecing together the fragments of gossip and fact that swirled around the tragedy. The post office, a squat building with a red-tiled roof, was the heart of the village's chatter, and Mrs. Muggleton, the postmistress, was its undisputed queen. Miss Marple found her sorting letters behind the counter, her eyes gleaming with the relish of fresh news. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Mrs. Muggleton said, pushing a stray curl under her cap. "I suppose you're here about that awful business with Mrs. Harcourt and Mr. Vale. No doubt he's been the talk of the village, lurking about like a lost puppy." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, her eyes bright with interest. "Mr. Vale? Yes, I've heard he was quite devoted to Mrs. Harcourt. A literary enthusiast, I take it." "Enthusiast?" Mrs. Muggleton snorted, leaning over the counter. "Obsessed. More like he's been in St. Mary Mead a week, renting the room upstairs, and every day he's at Rose Cottage, leaving notes, or just standing by the gate, clutching that old copy of her first novel, The Velvet Mask. I saw him myself, 2 nights before the murder, pacing the lane at dusk. Gave me the shivers, Miss Marple, with his wild eyes, and muttering." Miss Marple nodded, her fingers brushing the handle of her handbag. "How very curious. A true admirer, then. Did he ever speak of Mrs. Harcourt?" "Oh, plenty," Mrs. Muggleton replied, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He'd come in to buy stamps for his letters to Herlong, rambling things, from what I could see. Called her his muse and said her books changed his life. But last week, he was different, agitated, like said she'd betrayed him, though he wouldn't explain. And, Miss Marple, I found a parcel he sent her last month, a silk scarf, blue as the sky, just like the one they say was used to." She trailed off, her hand at her throat. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, though her expression remained serene. "A scarf. That's most interesting. I suppose he meant it as a gift. Poor man. Devotion can be so overwhelming, can't it?" Mrs. Muggleton nodded vigorously. "Poor man indeed, but there's something queer about him. Yesterday he bought a bottle of laudanum from the chemist. Said it was for headaches. Headaches, my eye. I told Inspector Crane. You can be sure." Miss Marple thanked her and climbed the narrow stairs to the room above, where Timothy Vale had agreed to meet her, prompted by a note from the vicar's wife. The room was small, its walls papered in faded roses, and Vale sat by a window, his lanky frame hunched over a battered copy of The Velvet Mask. He was in his 40s, with thinning hair and eyes that burned with a feverish intensity. His tweed jacket was patched at the elbows, and his fingers clutched the book as if it were a talisman. "Good morning, Mr. Vale," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair with the air of one merely passing the time. "I'm Jane Marple, friend of Mrs. Clements. I wanted to offer my sympathies about Mrs. Harcourt. You must be dreadfully shaken. Being such an admirer of her work." Vale's eyes flicked up, wary but brimming with emotion. "Sympathies," he said, his voice low and trembling. "It's more than that, Miss Marple. Elise Mrs. Harcourt was a genius, a light in a dark world. Her books, they understood me, spoke to me, and now she's gone." He pressed a hand to his forehead, his fingers trembling. Miss Marple's gaze was soft but piercing. "How very moving. You must have felt a special connection to her. Did you have the chance to meet her recently?" Vale nodded, his eyes glistening. "I saw her 3 days ago, at Rose Cottage. I brought her a letter, just to tell her how much her work meant. She was kind, but distant, said she was busy with her memoir. I begged her to reconsider it. Those secrets, those lies she was planning to tell, they'd ruin everything." His voice rose, then broke, and he buried his face in his hands. Miss Marple tilted her head, her voice as gentle as a breeze. "Ruin everything. That sounds rather serious. Was there something in the memoir that troubled you?" Vale's head snapped up, his cheeks flushed. "It wasn't right," he said fiercely. "She was going to expose people, good people, just to sell books. I told her it wasn't worthy of her. She laughed at me, said I didn't understand art, but I understood her better than anyone." His hands clenched, and Miss Marple noted the strength in them, belying his frail appearance. "I see," she said, her tone soothing. "It must have been painful, feeling she'd changed. I've heard you sent her gifts, a scarf, perhaps, a token of your admiration." Vale's eyes widened, and he shifted uncomfortably. "A scarf, yes. Months ago, I saw it in a shop in London. So fine, so like her. I thought she'd love it, but I didn't. I'd never." His voice faltered, and he looked away, his fingers tracing the book's cover. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes never leaving his face. "Of course, Mr. Vale." A thoughtful gesture. "I'm sure she appreciated it. Though it's odd, isn't it, how such a gift might end up in the wrong hands? The police are so thorough these days." Vale's face paled, and he stood abruptly, knocking the book to the floor. "I've told Inspector Crane everything," he said, his voice sharp. "I was here that night, in my room, reading. I'd never heard her. She was everything to me." His eyes filled with tears, and he turned to the window, his shoulders shaking. Miss Marple rose, her manner unruffled. "I'm sure you're right, Mr. Vale. I won't trouble you further. Do take care. This village can be overwhelming in times like these." She left him standing there, his silhouette stark against the misty glass dot outside. Miss Marple paused by the post office's flower boxes, her thoughts swirling. Vale's devotion was a tangled thread, woven with adoration and something darker, perhaps resentment at Eliza's rejection of his pleas. The scarf, identical to the murder weapon, was no coincidence, and his purchase of laudanum raised questions. She recalled a young man in St. Mary Mead, years ago, whose love for a singer had turned to obsession, ending in tragedy when she spurned him. Vale's tears, she thought, might be grief, but they could also be guilt. At the village shop, Miss Marple stopped to buy a spool of thread, using the opportunity to chat with Mr. Dobbs, the chemist. "That Mr. Vale," she said casually. "He's been poorly, I hear. Buying laudanum, was he?" Mr. Dobbs nodded, polishing his spectacles. "Came in yesterday, looking like he hadn't slept. Said he needed it for headaches, but he bought enough for a month. Odd chap, always muttering about Mrs. Harcourt's books. I told the inspector, just in case." Miss Marple thanked him and walked home, her mind a whirl of possibilities. Vale's obsession, the scarf, the laudanum all pointed to a man whose devotion might have curdled into something sinister. Yet the memoir's absence suggested a colder motive, one tied to secrets rather than passion. She thought of the attic, its locked door, and the intimacy of the crime. Vale, with his fervent letters and lingering presence, could have been welcomed into that space, only to turn on his idol in a moment of betrayal. As she reached her cottage, the mist had lifted, revealing the village in crisp clarity. Miss Marple settled into her parlor, her knitting needles resuming their rhythm. The pattern was growing clearer: Ramsay's desperation, Clara's ambition, and now Vale's obsession. Each suspect was a thread, but which had knotted round Eliza's throat. People, she murmured, her eyes on the fading light, are so very dangerous when they love too much. Chapter 5. The Nephew's Inheritance. The afternoon sun filtered through the elms of St. Mary Mead, casting dappled patterns on the cobbled path as Miss Jane Marple made her way to the village square. The air was crisp with the first hints of autumn, and the village, though still abuzz with the shock of Eliza Harcourt's murder, carried on with its daily rhythms: children playing by the duck pond, the blacksmith's hammer ringing in the distance. Yet Miss Marple's thoughts were far from the village's surface calm. Her mind, sharp as the needles in her knitting basket, turned to Leonard Harcourt, Eliza's nephew and heir, whose charming smile and careless ways had caught the attention of more than one gossip. A young man with expectations, she knew, could be as dangerous as any publisher or fan, especially when those expectations hung on a fragile thread. Leonard had been seen in St. Mary Mead the day of the murder, his flashy motorcar parked brazenly outside the Blue Boar. He was a man of 28, with the easy grace of youth and the restless eyes of one who lived beyond his means. Miss Marple, ever observant, had noted his presence at the village fete a month prior, where he'd charmed the ladies with tales of London while dodging questions about his finances. Now, with Eliza dead, the question of her estate loomed large, and Miss Marple resolved to learn more about this young man whose future depended on his aunt's legacy. Her destination was the tea shop, a cozy nook run by Miss Emily Hartnell, whose sharp ears missed little of the village's chatter. As Miss Marple entered, the bell above the door jingled, and Miss Hartnell greeted her with a nod, her apron dusted with flour. "Miss Marple, I thought you'd be by," she said, setting a pot of tea on the counter. "Everyone's talking about young Leonard Harcourt. They say he's set to inherit Rose Cottage and all Mrs. Harcourt's royalties. But there's a catch, isn't there?" Miss Marple settled at a table by the window, her black handbag at her side. A catch? How intriguing. I'd heard Leonard was close to his aunt, but village talk is so unreliable. "What have you heard, Miss Hartnell?" Miss Hartnell leaned closer, her voice a conspiratorial murmur. "My sister's friend, who works at the solicitor's in Much Benham, saw Mrs. Harcourt's will. It leaves everything to Leonard's house, money, the lot, but only if her memoir is published. If it's not, the estate goes to some literary charity in London. And word is, Leonard was at Rose Cottage the day she died, arguing about money. Mrs. Phipps, who lives next door, heard shouting, said he was begging for a loan for some grand venture." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "Arguing. That's most unfortunate. Young men can be so impulsive, can't they? Did Mrs. Phipps say anything else?" "She did," Miss Hartnell replied, pouring tea with a flourish. "Said Leonard left the cottage around 7, looking cross as thunder. And he was at the Red Lion that night, boasting about a big windfall coming his way. Drank enough to sink a ship, too, according to the barman." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind weaving this new information into the pattern of the case. A will tied to the memoir's publication was a powerful motive, especially for a young man in need of funds. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, years ago, where a nephew had forged a will to secure his inheritance, only to be undone by a careless signature. Leonard, with his charm and debts, might have seen Eliza's death as a shortcut to wealth, provided the memoir never saw the light of day. determined to meet the young man herself. Miss Marple sent a note to Leonard, requesting a visit, on the pretext of discussing a memorial for his aunt. He agreed, and by late afternoon, she found herself in the parlor of Rose Cottage, where Leonard had been staying since the murder. The room was cluttered with Eliza's books and papers, a stark contrast to Leonard's polished appearances. Suit was well cut, his watch gleamed with newness, and his smile was as bright as a stage actor's. Yet Miss Marple noted the faint redness in his eyes, a sign of sleepless nights, or perhaps too many evenings at the Red Lion. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," Leonard said, offering her a chair with a flourish. "Awfully kind of you to call. This business with Aunt Eliza's knocked me for 6. I'm still trying to wrap my head around it." His voice was warm, but his fingers drummed on the armrest, betraying a restless energy. Miss Marple smiled, her manner as gentle as a summer breeze. "It's a dreadful shock, Mr. Harcourt. Your aunt was such a remarkable woman. I understand you saw her the day she passed. It must be a comfort to have had that time with her." Leonard's smile faltered, and he shifted in his seat. "Yes, I dropped by to catch up. She was busy with her writing, as usual, but we had a chat. Nothing out of the ordinary, just family matters." His tone was casual, but his eyes flicked to the window, avoiding hers. Miss Marple tilted her head, her voice soft but probing. "Family matters can be so complex, can't they? I've heard your aunt was working on a memoir, quite a significant project. Did she share any details with you?" Leonard's fingers stilled, and a shadow crossed his face. "She mentioned it, yes. Full of her usual dramatics, secrets and scandals. I told her to be careful. Books like that can stir up trouble. But Aunt Eliza never listened to anyone." He laughed, a touch too loudly, and reached for a cigarette, lighting it with a trembling hand. Miss Marple's gaze was steady, her eyes taking in every detail, the expensive watch, the nervous gesture, the forced laughter. "How wise of you to caution her," she said. "A memoir can be a dangerous thing, especially if it threatens someone's reputation, or perhaps their plans. I've heard you have ambitions, Mr. Harcourt, a business venture, perhaps." Leonard's cigarette paused halfway to his lips, and his smile tightened. "Village gossip, I suppose." "Yes, I've got plans, a motor car dealership in London. Nothing wrong with wanting to make my own way, is there? Aunt Eliza was generous, but she could be difficult about money, always going on about earning my keep." His voice carried a hint of bitterness, quickly masked by another smile. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of kindly interest. "Of course, young men must make their mark. Though it's curious, isn't it, how your aunt's will ties her estate to the memoir's publication? It must weigh heavily on you, with so much at stake." Leonard's eyes narrowed, but he recovered quickly, exhaling a plume of smoke. "The will? Oh, I don't bother with that sort of thing. Aunt Eliza's lawyer handles it. I just want to see her memory honored, you know?" He stood, signaling the end of the conversation. "I've got to meet Inspector Crane soon. Miss Marple, thanks for stopping by." Miss Marple rose, her manner unruffled. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Harcourt. Do take care, this village has a way of watching its own." She smiled, her words gentle but laced with a quiet warning, and left the cottage outside. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber. Miss Marple walked slowly, her thoughts a tapestry of clues. Leonard's charm was a polished veneer, but beneath it lay a current of desperation. The will's condition, the argument overheard by Mrs. Phipps, his boasts at the Red Lion all suggested a young man who saw his aunt's death as a path to freedom, provided the memoir was suppressed. She recalled a farmer's son in St. Mary Mead who had sabotaged a rival's crops to secure his inheritance. Greed, she knew, could make even the laziest hands swift to act at home. Miss Marple settled into her parlor, her knitting resuming its familiar rhythm. The scarf, the missing memoir, Leonard's flashy watch, these were pieces of a puzzle that grew ever more intricate. She thought of Ramsay's desperation, Clara's ambition, Vale's obsession, and now Leonard's greed. Each suspect was a knot in the thread, but the truth, she felt, was closer than ever. People, she murmured, her eyes on the darkening village, are so very reckless when they think they've won. Chapter 6. The village whispers. The evening settled over St. Mary Mead, like a soft shawl. The village lamps casting a warm glow on the cobbled lanes as the stars began to prick the sky. Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden, a cup of chamomile tea cooling on the table beside her, her knitting needles idle for once. The murder of Eliza Harcourt had woven a web of unease through the village, and the air was thick with whisper snippets of conjecture and half-truths that drifted from shop to pub to parlor. Miss Marple, with her gift for sifting gossip, as one might sift flour, knew that truth often hid in the crevices of such talk, waiting to be teased out by a patient hand. Tonight, she resolved to gather these threads. For the pattern of the crime was beginning to take shape in her mind. The village was a living tapestry, its residents stitching their own stories into the fabric of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, ever the observer, had spent the day moving among them, her presence as unassuming as a sparrow. She began at the grocer's, where Mr. Tuttle, a man with a face like a weathered apple, was stacking jars of marmalade. "Miss Marple," he greeted, wiping his hands on his apron, "you'll be thinking about poor Mrs. Harcourt, I reckon. The whole village is in a tizzy, and no wonder, with that publisher fellow skulking about." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled as she selected a tin of biscuits. "Mr. Ramsay, you mean? I heard he was staying at the Blue Boar. A busy man, coming all this way." "Busy, aye, and up to no good, if you ask me," Mr. Tuttle said, lowering his voice. "My lad saw him walking near Rose Cottage the night of the murder, well past 10, though he told the police he was back at the inn by 9, looked furtive. He did, head down and hurrying. I told Inspector Crane, but you know how these city folk twist their stories." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of mild surprise. How very curious. A late walk, perhaps, to clear his mind, though it's odd, with the village so quiet at that hour. Mr. Tuttle snorted. "Clear his mind, my foot. He was up to something, mark my words. And that memoir everyone's talking about, my wife says it was full of secrets that'd make a bishop blush. No wonder someone wanted it gone." Miss Marple thanked him and moved on to the post office, where Mrs. Muggleton was sorting letters with her usual zeal. The postmistress's eyes lit up at the sight of Miss Marple, sensing a chance to share her latest tidings. "Miss Marple, you'll never guess what I saw," she began, leaning over the counter. "That Miss Dunham, the editor, was burning papers in her guest-house fireplace 2 nights ago. I was passing by with my dog, and there she was, poking at the flames like she was hiding the crown jewels. Thick papers, too, like a book, and her face white as a sheet." Miss Marple's fingers brushed the edge of her handbag, her mind filing away this detail. Burning papers. Perhaps she was clearing out old drafts. Editors are so particular, aren't they? Particular, maybe, but she was scared, Mrs. Muggleton insisted, and the next day, Mrs. Harcourt's found dead, with her memoir gone. I told the inspector, "You can be sure. It's not right, burning things like that, after a murder." Miss Marple murmured her agreement, her thoughts turning to Clara Dunham's nervous ring-twisting and muddy coat. Burning papers suggested a secret too dangerous to keep, and Clara's ambition made her a likely candidate for such secrecy. But Miss Marple's inquiries were not yet done. At the chemist's, Mr. Dobbs was polishing his counter, his spectacles glinting as he recounted Timothy Vale's purchase of laudanum. "Said it was for headaches," he told her, "but he bought enough to fell a horse. And the way he kept muttering about Mrs. Harcourt, clutching that book of Hearst wasn't natural." Miss Marple, the Red Lion, provided the final piece of the day's puzzle. Miss Marple, under the guise of collecting for the church fund, chatted with the barman, a jovial man named Tom who knew every patron's habits. "Young Leonard Harcourt was in here the night his aunt died," Tom said, polishing a glass, "drinking like there was no tomorrow, boasting about a big windfall that had set him up for life. Said he'd be driving a new motor car by Christmas. Seemed mighty sure of himself, considering his aunt was still warm." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, though her smile remained serene. How confident of him. Young men do dream big, don't they? Did he mention his aunt at all? "Not a word," Tom replied, which struck me as odd, seeing as he'd been at Rose Cottage that evening. Mrs. Phipps, who lives next door, said she heard them arguing something about money and that memoir. Leonard stormed out around 7, and by 9, he was here, toasting his future. Miss Marple thanked Tom and returned to her garden, where the evening's stillness wrapped around her like a cloak. She sipped her tea, her mind a whirl of whispers. Ramsay's late-night walk, Clara's burned papers, Vale's laudanum, Leonard's boasts. Each suspect had been near Rose Cottage. Each had a reason to fear the memoir, and each, she suspected, was hiding something. The attic's locked door, the silk scarf, the missing manuscript, these were the knots in the thread, and she was determined to unravel them. She thought of the scarf, its blue silk monogrammed with Ramsay's initials, a gift turned weapon. Its presence in the attic suggested intimacy, a trust betrayed. Ramsay's furtive walk, contradicting his alibi, pointed to a man desperate to protect his empire. Clara's burned papers hinted at a secret she couldn't risk exposing, perhaps tied to her dreams of usurping Ramsay's firm. Vale's laudanum, an obsession suggested a mind unhinged by rejection, capable of turning love to violence. And Leonard, with his debts and dreams, had the most to gain from Eliza's death. Provided the memoir vanished, Miss Marple recalled a case in St. Mary, Mead, years ago, where a grocer's wife had poisoned her husband to hide her thefts, only to be betrayed by a neighbor's idle remark. Gossip, she knew, was a double-edged sword, unreliable, yet often laced with truth. The village's whispers were like her knitting, each stitch a clue, each row bringing the pattern closer to completion. She resolved to revisit Rose Cottage, certain that the attic held more secrets than the police had found. As the stars brightened above, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to human nature, greed, ambition, obsession, all woven into the crime. The killer, she felt, was someone Eliza had trusted. Someone who knew the attic's solitude and the scarf's significance. People, she murmured, her eyes on the darkened village, are so very clever at hiding their truths, but the truth has a way of slipping out. Chapter 7. The Attic's Secrets. The morning sun broke through the mist that clung to St. Mary Mead, gilding the rooftops and lending a deceptive calm to the village still reeling from Eliza Harcourt's murder. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, walked toward Rose Cottage with a purpose that belied her gentle demeanor. The whispers of the village Ramsay's late-night walk, Clara's burned papers, Vale's laudanum, Leonard's boasts had woven a web of suspicion. But Miss Marple knew that the truth lay not in gossip, but in the silent details of the crime itself. The attic, with its locked door and tragic tableau, called to her like an unfinished pattern, its secrets waiting to be unpicked by her careful hands. Inspector Crane had reluctantly agreed to let her revisit the crime scene, his respect for her insights tempered by a policeman's wariness of meddling spinsters. As they climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, the air grew heavy with the scent of old paper and dust. The room was much as Miss Marple remembered, a low-ceilinged space, cluttered with books, manuscripts, and a typewriter perched on a scarred oak desk. The chalk outline of Eliza's body marked the floor near the desk, a grim reminder of the violence that had unfolded here. The silk scarf, now in police custody, was absent, but its image lingered in Miss Marple's mind. A gift turned deadly. Crane gestured to the room, his voice brisk. "We've combed through it, Miss Marple. But there's little to go on. No fingerprints, no signs of forced entry. The door was locked from the inside, key still in the lock. Whoever did this was either let in by Mrs. Harcourt or knew their way around. The memoir's gone, except for a few notes, and that scarf, well, Ramsay's admitted it was his gift. But he swears he was at the Blue Boar by 9. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes roaming the attic with the precision of a seamstress inspecting a hem. She noted the open window, its frame weathered but intact, letting in a breeze that stirred the faded curtains. The typewriter caught her attention, its keys gleaming except for one, the letter E, which bore a faint scratch, barely visible unless one looked closely. She bent forward, her spectacles catching the light, and traced the mark with a gloved finger. "How curious," she murmured. "This scratch, it's fresh, isn't it? As if something struck the key during a struggle." Crane frowned, peering at the typewriter. "We noticed it, but it could be wear and tear. Mrs. Harcourt typed all hours, they say. Still, I'll have it looked at again." Miss Marple's gaze moved to the desk, where a blotter lay askew, its edge curling slightly. She lifted it gently, revealing a single sheet of paper tucked beneath a page from the memoir, its ink still sharp. The text was brief but damning. He who built his empire on stolen words, smiling as he claimed credit for others' genius. The words, she thought, pointed to a man in publishing, and Ramsay's sleek confidence came to mind. She slipped the page back, her expression serene, but her mind racing. "This page," she said, "it's rather telling, isn't it? I wonder how many such pages were taken." Crane rubbed his chin. "We found a few notes, but the bulk of the manuscripts vanished. If the killer took it, they were thorough except for this. Makes me think they were in a hurry." Miss Marple stepped to the window, her fingers brushing the sill. A faint smudge of dirt caught her eye, barely noticeable against the weathered wood. "This window," she said, "it was open when Mr. Timmins found her. Could someone have climbed in?" Crane shook his head. "Unlikely. It's a straight drop to the garden. No ladder marks, no footprints in the flower beds. Timmins swears the ground was untouched. Besides, the locked door suggests she let her killer in." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts turning inward. The locked door, the scarf, the missing memorial, pointed to a crime of intimacy, committed by someone Eliza trusted enough to admit to her private sanctum. She sat in the chair by the desk, imagining the scene, Eliza typing, the killer entering, perhaps invited for tea or a late discussion. The scarf, already in the room, became the weapon, swift, silent, personal. The scratch on the typewriter suggested a brief struggle, a hand flailing, perhaps striking the keys. But why take the memoir? To silence its secrets, of course, but the single page left behind was a careless slip. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a maid had stolen a letter to hide her theft, only to leave a torn corner that betrayed her. Carelessness, Miss Marple knew, was the downfall of many. A criminal. Her eyes drifted to the floor, where a tiny splinter in the floorboard caught her attention. Kneeling with surprising agility, she peered closer, spotting a thread of navy fabric caught in the wood fine, like a man's suit, not the coarse cloth of a villager's coat. "Inspector," she said, pointing, "this thread might it be from a jacket? Someone well dressed, perhaps." Crane crouched beside her, his face lighting with interest. "Good eye, Miss Marple. Could be from the killer's clothing. We'll send it to the lab, though it's small. Might match something Ramsay or young Harcourt was wearing." Miss Marple rose, her mind weaving the clues together. The thread, the scratched key, the memoir's page-all, were stitches in the pattern. Ramsay's monogrammed scarf and late-night walk made him a likely suspect. But Clara's burned papers, Vale's obsession, and Leonard's greed could not be dismissed. The attic's solitude suggested a killer who knew Eliza's habits, who could enter without suspicion. She thought of the scarf, its silk, a symbol of trust, turned to betrayal. Ramsay had admitted giving it to Eliza, but had he retrieved it in anger, or had another used it to point suspicion his way? As they descended the stairs, Miss Marple paused, her gaze lingering on the cottage's garden, where roses still bloomed, despite the tragedy. "Inspector," she said, her voice soft, "this attic feels like a stage, doesn't it? A private performance, with only two players, Mrs. Harcourt and her killer. Whoever it was, they knew her well." Crane nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're right, Miss Marple. It's personal, this murder. But with that memoir gone, we're grasping at straws. Any thoughts on who might have wanted it silenced?" Miss Marple smiled, her eyes distant. "Oh, many people, I imagine. A publisher fearing ruin, an editor guarding her future, a fan betrayed by his idol, a nephew chasing a fortune. But the truth, Inspector, is in the details, the scratch, the thread, the page. They'll tell us more than any confession." They parted at the cottage gate, and Miss Marple walked home, her steps slow but her mind alight. The attic had revealed its secrets grudgingly, but each clue was a step toward the truth. She thought of Ramsay's gold ring, heavy enough to scratch, a key Clara's muddy coat, perhaps stained from a late visit, Vale's strength, hidden in his lanky frame, Leonard's watch, bought with borrowed funds. The killer, she felt, was someone who had stood in that attic, their heart pounding as they tightened the scarf. "People," she murmured, her eyes, on the village's twinkling lights, "are so very blind to the traces they leave." Chapter 8. The Confrontation. The village hall of St. Mary Mead glowed softly under the evening lamps, its stone walls adorned with bunting left over from the summer fete, now a curious contrast to the somber gathering within. Miss Jane Marple, her black lace cap neat, and her shawl draped with precision, had orchestrated this meeting under the guise of planning a memorial for Eliza Harcourt. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, had eagerly supported the idea, her kind heart oblivious to Miss Marple's true intent, to bring the four suspects Gerald Ramsay, Clara Dunham, Timothy Vale, and Leonard Harcourt into one room, where their reactions might betray the truth. The air was thick with the scent of polished wood and tea, but beneath the civility lay a tension as taut as a violin string, and Miss Marple, with her keen eye for human nature, was ready to pluck it. The hall was modestly filled. Villagers curious about the murder mingled with the suspects, who sat in a loose semicircle near the front. Ramsay, impeccable in his tailored suit, exuded a forced joviality, his silver hair gleaming as he nodded to acquaintances. Clara Dunham, her severe bob framing a guarded expression, clutched a notebook, her silver ring catching the light as she twisted it. Timothy Vale, hunched and restless, gripped his worn copy of the Velvet Mask, his eyes darting like a cornered animal's. Leonard Harcourt lounged with practiced ease, his flashy watch glinting, but his smile was too bright, his fingers tapping a nervous rhythm on his knee. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively to one side, observed them all, her knitting needles silent in her basket, but her mind stitching together the clues, the monogrammed scarf, the scratched typewriter key, the navy thread, the missing memoir. Mrs. Clement opened the meeting with a few words about Eliza's contributions to literature, her voice trembling with emotion. "We must honor her memory," she said, "and ensure her work endures." As she spoke, Miss Marple's eyes flicked from face to face, noting Ramsay's tight smile, Clara's stiff nod, Vale's fidgeting, and Leonard's barely concealed boredom. When Mrs. Clement invited suggestions for the memorial, Miss Marple rose, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze, but carrying a weight that silenced the room. "Thank you, Mrs. Clement," she began, her spectacles glinting. "It's heartwarming to see so many here to remember Mrs. Harcourt. Her memoir, I understand, was to be her crowning achievement, a work of truth, perhaps too much truth for some." She paused, her gaze sweeping the suspects. Ramsay's hand tightened on his chair's armrest. Clara's pen froze mid-note. Vale's knuckles whitened on his book. Leonard's smile faltered, replaced by a nervous laugh. Miss Marple continued, her tone deceptively mild. It's curious, isn't it, how that memoir has vanished, save for a single page found in the attic. A page that spoke of a man who built his empire on stolen words. Such a revelation would unsettle many, I imagine publishers, editors, even admirers or heirs. She let the words hang, watching as Ramsay's face paled, Clara's eyes narrowed, Vale's breath quickened, and Leonard shifted uncomfortably. Ramsay stood, his voice smooth but edged with irritation. Miss Marple, I hope you're not suggesting anything untoward. Eliza's memoir was a work in progress, full of exaggerations. I discussed it with her that day, as I told the police, and left her quite alive. I was back at the Blue Boar by 9. His eyes challenged hers, but Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in his hand. The way his gold ring caught the lighter ring heavy enough to scratch a typewriter key. Clara spoke next, her voice sharp. I, too, met with Eliza, and we argued, as I've admitted. But I was at the guest house all evening, as Mrs. Grayson can confirm. This talk of the memoir is irrelevant. It was a draft, nothing more. Her fingers twisted her ring, and Miss Marple recalled the burned papers, the muddy coat, signs of a woman hiding more than she revealed. Vale's voice was a hoarse whisper, his eyes wild. She was my muse. I'd never harm her, never. That memoir, it was a mistake, but I only begged her to stop. I was in my room, reading, when it happened. His hands shook, and Miss Marple thought of the laudanum, the scarf he'd sent, his obsession teetering on the edge of madness. Leonard laughed, a brittle sound. This is all a bit dramatic, isn't it? Aunt Eliza loved stirring up trouble. But I was just her nephew, not her keeper. I saw her that afternoon, sure, but I was at the Red Lion by 9, as Tom the barman will tell you. His casual tone didn't mask the sweat on his brow, and Miss Marple remembered his boasts of a windfall tied to a will that hinged on the memoir's fate. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice soft but commanding. The attic tells its own story, doesn't it? A locked door, a silk scarf, Mr. Ramsay's gift, I believe used to silence a woman who knew too much. A typewriter key scratched, perhaps in a struggle, and a thread of navy cloth caught in a floorboard, suggesting a well-dressed visitor. The memoir's absence speaks loudest, for it threatened someone's world, be it a publisher's empire, an editor's ambitions, a fan's illusions, or an heir's fortune. The room was silent, the villagers leaning forward, the suspects frozen. Ramsay's face reddened, and he snapped, "This is preposterous. I have nothing to hide. The police have my statement, and I won't be slandered by village gossip." His outburst drew murmurs, but Miss Marple's calm gaze held him, noting the sweat on his upper lip. Clara stood, her notebook clutched like a shield. "You're grasping at shadows, Miss Marple. I respected Eliza, even if we disagreed. I was nowhere near that attic." Yet her eyes flicked to Ramsay, a glance so brief Miss Marple nearly missed. Vale's voice broke the tension, a sob escaping him. "I loved her. You can't think I'd add. I couldn't." He buried his face in his book, and Miss Marple wondered if his tears were for Eliza or for himself. Leonard leaned back, his smirk returning. "Let the police do their job, Miss Marple. You're stirring up trouble, just like Aunt Eliza." But his fingers betrayed him, twisting the cuff of his jacket, a navy jacket. Miss Marple noted, like the thread in the attic. Mrs. Clement, flustered, called for order, but Miss Marple raised a hand, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "The truth, my friends, is like a dropped stitch. It seems small, but it unravels everything. Someone in this room knows more than they've said. The attic will tell, in time." She sat, her smile serene, but her words had struck like a pebble in a pond, sending ripples through the suspect's composure, as the meeting dissolved into plans for a simple plaque. Miss Marple watched the suspects disperse, Ramsay striding out with forced dignity, Clara hurrying after, Vale slinking away, Leonard lingering to charm a villager. She recalled a church bazaar, years ago, where a thief had betrayed himself by glancing too often at a stolen purse. Tonight, she had seen those glances: Ramsay's tremor, Clara's flicker, Vale's tears, Leonard's smirk. The killer, she felt, was among them, their masks slipping under her gentle prodding. Walking home through the quiet lanes, Miss Marple's thoughts were a tapestry of clues: the scarf's monogram, the scratched key, the navy thread, the memoir's page. The confrontation had revealed no confession, but it had tightened the threads, drawing the pattern closer to completion. People, she murmured, her eyes on the starlit village, are so very careless when they think they're unseen. Chapter 9. The publisher's motive. The soft glow of morning filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns on the parlor floor as she prepared for a visit from Gerald Ramsay. The village of St. Mary, Mead, though outwardly serene, with its blooming gardens and chirping sparrows, hummed with the undercurrent of Eliza Harcourt's murder. Miss Marple, her knitting basket at her side, had spent the night piecing together the threads of the case: a monogrammed scarf, the scratched typewriter key, the navy thread, the missing memoir, and her thoughts kept circling back to Ramsay, the polished publisher whose empire seemed poised on the edge of ruin. His presence at the village hall the previous evening, his trembling hand and forced joviality, had confirmed her suspicion. He was a man under pressure, and pressure, she knew, could drive even the most urbane to desperate acts. She had sent a note to Ramsay, inviting him for tea, under the pretext of discussing Eliza's literary legacy. He arrived promptly at 10, his silver hair immaculate and his suit as crisp as ever. But Miss Marple noted the faint lines of strain around his gray eyes, the way his gold ring gleamed as he adjusted his cufflinks. The parlor, with its cushions and ticking clock, was a disarming setting, and Miss Marple's smile, as she poured tea from a rose-patterned pot, was the essence of village hospitality. "Mr. Ramsay, how kind of you to come," she said, her voice soft as she handed him a cup. "I've been thinking so much about poor Mrs. Harcourt and her work. Her memoir, they say, was to be quite a revelation. You must have been deeply involved, as her publisher." Ramsay's smile was smooth, but his fingers tightened briefly on the saucer. "Indeed, Miss Marple," he replied, his tone polished. "Eliza was a brilliant writer, if a touch reckless. Her memoir was ambitious, but we were still refining it. A pity it's been lost." His eyes met hers, steady but guarded, and Miss Marple sensed the effort behind his composure. She tilted her head, her spectacles catching the light. "Lost? Yes, how unfortunate. Though I did hear a page was found in the attic, speaking of a man who built his empire on stolen words. Such an accusation must have worried you, with your reputation so tied to your author's trust." Ramsay's smile faltered, and he set his cup down with a faint clink. "Village gossip, I presume," he said, his voice cool but edged with irritation. "Eliza had a flair for drama. That page was fiction, nothing more. She loved to stir up trouble, but I assure you, my firm is built on honest work. I told her as much when we met that day." His fingers brushed his ring, and Miss Marple noted the gesture, recalling the scratched typewriter key. "How reassuring," she said, her tone as gentle as a lullaby. "Though it's curious, isn't it, how the memoir vanished, save for that one page. And the scarf, your gift, I believe used in such a dreadful way. It must distress you, knowing something so personal was turned against her." Ramsay's face reddened, and he leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Miss Marple, I hope you're not implying anything. That scarf was a trifle, given a year ago. I had no reason to harm Eliza. She was my best author. Yes, we argued about the memoir. It was too sensational, too risky, but I left her alive. And well, as I told Inspector Crane, I was back at the Blue Boar by 9, as Sally can confirm." His words were firm, but his hand trembled slightly. Betraying the strain, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes never leaving his. Of course, Mr. Ramsay. Though I did hear such a small village. You'll know that you were seen near Rose Cottage later that night, closer to 10, a walk perhaps, to clear your mind. Ramsay's eyes widened, and for a moment, his composure cracked. Who said that? It's nonsense. I was in my room, preparing for a meeting. This village is full of busybodies, spinning tales. He forced a laugh, but it rang hollow, and Miss Marple noted the sweat on his brow, the way his ring caught the light as he gestured. She smiled, her expression one of kindly concern. Villages are like that, aren't they? Everyone sees everything. I suppose the memoir's accusations would have been ruinous for a man in your position. I've heard your firm has financial troubles. A book exposing plagiarism could topple even the strongest empire. Ramsay stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. This is absurd. My firm is sound, and I won't be slandered by an old woman's fancies. Eliza was unstable, her memoir a pack of lies. I tried to reason with her, but she wouldn't listen. I had nothing to do with her death. His voice rose, and he caught himself, smoothing his tie with a trembling hand. I must go, Miss Marple. I have business in London. Miss Marple rose, her manner unruffled. Of course, Mr. Ramsay. Thank you for the chat. Do take care. The police are so thorough, and those little details, like a scratched key or a thread in a floorboard, have a way of telling stories. Her smile was serene, but her words landed like a dart, and Ramsay's face paled as he strode out, alone in her parlor. Miss Marple settled back with her knitting, the needles clicking softly. Ramsay's agitation, his trembling hand, his denial of the late-night walk all pointed to a man teetering on the edge. She recalled a London banker she'd once met, whose polished exterior hid a web of fraud, exposed by a single ledger entry. Ramsay's firm, village gossip whispered, was in debt, its survival tied to his reputation. The memoir's accusations plagiarism, deceit would have been a death blow, and his gift of the scarf placed him squarely in the attic's deadly scene. She thought of the clues, the scratched typewriter key, likely struck by Ramsay's heavy ring, the navy thread, matching his suit. The memoir's page, left behind in haste. His claim of being at the Blue Boar by 9 was undone by the grocer's lad, who'd seen him near Rose Cottage at 10. Yet the other suspects, Clara Vale, Leonard remained in the pattern. Clara's burned papers suggested she, too, feared the memoir. Vale's obsession could have turned violent. Leonard's greed hinged on the manuscript's suppression. But Ramsay's motive, tied to his crumbling empire, burned brightest in her mind. Miss Marple's needles paused as she gazed out the window, where the village lay bathed in morning light. The truth was close. She felt like a stitch waiting to be secured. Ramsay's desperation, masked by his charm, was a thread she could not ignore. People, she murmured, her eyes on the quiet lanes, are so very fragile when their masks begin to slip. Chapter 10. The final clue. Late morning sun cast a golden sheen over St. Mary Mead, its rays filtering through the ancient oaks that lined the lane to Rose Cottage. Miss Jane Marple, her black handbag tucked under her arm, walked with a quiet determination, her mind a whirl of threads woven from the village's whispers and the attic's silent testimony. The confrontation at the village hall had tightened the web around the suspect's Gerald Ramsay's agitation. Clara Dunham's guarded glances, Timothy Vale's tears, and Leonard Harcourt's forced nonchalance, but the truth, Miss Marple knew, lay in the smallest details. Those overlooked stitches that could unravel a killer's design. With Inspector Crane's permission, she had arranged to revisit the attic, certain that one final clue would complete the pattern of Eliza Harcourt's murder. The cottage stood forlorn, its roses drooping as if in mourning, and the air held a chill despite the sunlight. Inspector Crane met her at the gate, his face etched with the wariness of a man grappling with a stubborn case. "Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat, "I hope you're right about finding something new. We've turned this place upside down, but the memoir's gone, and the scarf alone isn't enough to pin anyone down." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. "Sometimes, Inspector, it's the smallest thing, huh? Thread, a mark that speaks loudest. Shall we?" They climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, the creak of the boards, a somber echo in the silent house. The room was as she remembered, cluttered with books, papers, and the typewriter on its worn desk, the chalk outline of Eliza's body, a stark reminder of the crime. The window stood open, letting in a breeze that stirred the curtains, and the faint scent of ink lingered, as if Eliza's presence still haunted the space. Miss Marple's gaze settled on the typewriter, its keys gleaming except for the scratched E, a mark she believed held the key to the struggle. She bent closer, her gloved fingers tracing the scratch, which was sharp and crescent-shaped, as if made by a heavy object. "This mark," she said, her voice soft, "it's not from where, Inspector. It's too precise, too fresh, I suspect. It was made during a struggle perhaps by a ring, something solid and sharp-edged." Crane peered at the key, his brow furrowing. "A ring. Ramsay wears one, doesn't he? Gold heavy-looking. Could it have struck the key if he grabbed her?" Miss Marple nodded, her mind flashing to Ramsay's trembling hand at their tea, the way his ring caught the light. Possibly. A man in a temper, reaching for the scarf, might have flailed, striking the typewriter. But let's look further. She moved to the desk, her eyes scanning its surface. The blotter, under which she'd found the memoir's damning page, was undisturbed, but a faint smudge of ink on its edge caught her attention. She lifted it carefully, revealing nothing new. Yet the smudge suggested Eliza had been writing just before her death. Her hand perhaps unsteady under threat, her gaze drifted to the floor, where the navy thread had been found, caught in a splintered floorboard. Kneeling with surprising grace, she examined the spot again, her fingers brushing the wood. "This thread," she said, "from a fine suit, not a villager's rough cloth. Mr. Ramsay's navy jacket comes to mind, or perhaps young Mr. Harcourt's, though his is newer, less worn. It's a small thing, but it places someone well in this room." Crane crouched beside her, his interest piqued. "We sent the thread for analysis, but it's too small for much. Still, Ramsay's been evasive about his movements, and that boy Leonard's no saint. You think one of them was here?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, but she said nothing, her attention drawn to a corner of the attic, where a stack of books leaned precariously. She approached, noting a faint scuff mark on the floor, as if something had been dragged. Behind the books, wedged against the wall, was a single sheet of paper, crumpled and overlooked. She retrieved it with care, smoothing it out to reveal another fragment of the memoir. His empire, built on lies, teetered on the edge of collapse, and he knew it. The words were a mirror to the page she'd found before, reinforcing the accusation against a powerful man Ramsay, she thought, whose financial troubles were the talk of the village. "Another page," Crane said, taking it with gloved hands. "How did we miss this? The killer must have been in a rush, leaving bits behind." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. "A rush? Yes, or interrupted. The attic's isolation suggests. The killer was someone Eliza trusted, someone she let in without fear. The scarf, Mr. Ramsay's gift, was here, ready to hand. The thread, the scratched key, these pages all point to a moment of panic, a plan not quite perfected." She stepped to the window, her gaze falling on the garden below, where the roses stood untouched, no sign of a ladder or footprints. The locked door, she mused, ruled out an outsider, but the open window nagged at her. "Inspector," she said, "have you considered the window's latch? It's loose, isn't it? Could someone have climbed out, locking the door from inside to mislead us?" Crane tested the latch, which wobbled slightly. "Possible, but risky. It's a drop to the ground, and Timon swore the garden was undisturbed. Still, I'll have it checked for prints. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the suspects. Ramsay's ring could have scratched the key, his navy suit matched the thread, and his motive protecting a crumbling empire was clear. Yet Clara's burned papers hinted at her own secrets, perhaps tied to her ambitions. Vale's laudanum, an obsession, suggested a volatile mind. Leonard's greed, tied to the will's conditions, made him a contender. The attic's clues, though, pointed most strongly to Ramsay, whose presence in the village, whose gift, whose desperation, wove him into the crime's fabric. As they left the attic, Miss Marple paused on the stairs, her hand on the banister. "Inspector, this room feels like a confession, doesn't it? The killer stood here, their heart racing, believing they'd erased their traces. But they left too much: the thread, the scratch, the pages. They always do." Crane nodded, his respect for her growing. "You've a knack for this, Miss Marple. I'll have Ramsay brought in again. That ring and thread might just clinch it." Walking home, Miss Marple's mind was a tapestry of clues, each stitch tightening the noose. She recalled a village tailor, years ago, whose theft was revealed by a single button left at a crime scene. Ramsay's ring, she felt, was her button, and the attic's secrets were her thread. "People," she murmured, her eyes on the sunlit village, "are so very careless when they think they've escaped." Chapter 11. The Confession. The village hall of St. Mary Mead, bathed in the soft glow of evening lamps, was a study in contrasts, cheerful bunting and polished oak beams, at odds with the somber purpose of the gathering. Miss Jane Marple had arranged this final assembly, ostensibly to finalize plans for Eliza Harcourt's memorial, but her true intent was to lay bare the truth of the author's murder. The air was heavy with anticipation. The villagers seated in rows, their whispers hushed as they watched the four suspects: Gerald Ramsay, Clara Dunham, Timothy Vale, and Leonard Harcourt, take their places at the front. Miss Marple, her black lace cap neat and her shawl draped with precision, sat to one side, her eyes as sharp as the needles in her basket, ready to unravel the final knot in the tapestry of the crime. The hall was quieter than the previous meeting, the weight of the unsolved murder pressing on every heart. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, opened with a few faltering words about Eliza's legacy, but her eyes kept drifting to Miss Marple, as if sensing the old lady's quiet authority. The suspects, too, seemed on edge. Ramsay's polished smile was strained, his fingers brushing his gold ring. Clara clutched her notebook, her severe bob framing a tense expression. Vale gripped his copy of The Velvet Mask, his eyes red-rimmed. Leonard lounged with forced ease, but his flashy watch glinted as his hand twitched. Miss Marple observed them all, her mind weaving together the clues: the monogrammed scarf, the scratched typewriter key, the navy thread, the memoirs, damning pages. When Mrs. Clement yielded the floor, Miss Marple rose, her frail figure commanding the room with a quiet strength. "My friends," she began, her voice soft but clear, "we are here to honor Mrs. Harcourt, but also to seek justice for her. Her death in that attic, strangled with a silk scarf, was no random act. It was personal, calculated, born of fear of her memoir, which promised to expose a truth someone could not bear." Her gaze swept the suspects, and the hall fell silent, every eye fixed on her. She stepped forward, her spectacles glinting. "The attic has told us much. A locked door, suggesting a trusted visitor. A silk scarf, monogrammed with Mr. Ramsay's initials, turned into a weapon. A typewriter key, scratched by a heavy ring. A navy thread, caught in a floorboard, from a fine suit. And pages of a memoir, left behind in haste, accusing a man of building his empire on stolen words." She paused, letting the words settle like dust. Ramsay's face paled, Clara's pen froze, Vale's breath hitched, and Leonard's smirk vanished. Miss Marple turned to Ramsay, her tone gentle but unrelenting. "Mr. Ramsay, you gave Eliza that scarf, a gift of trust. You visited her that day, arguing about her memoir, which threatened your firm already faltering, as village talk confirms. You claimed to be at the Blue Boar by 9, yet you were, say near Rose Cottage at 10, and your ring, so distinctive, matches the scratch on the typewriter key. A thread from your navy suit was found in the attic. These are not coincidences, are they? Ramsay leaped to his feet, his voice a mix of fury and fear. This is outrageous. I told you, I left Eliza alive. My firm is sound, and that memoir was nonsense, pure fiction. You've no proof, just village tittle-tattle. His hand shook, the gold ring flashing, and Miss Marple noted the sweat on his brow, the desperation in his eyes. She turned to the others, her voice calm. Miss Dunham, your ambition to start your own publishing house depended on Mr. Ramsay's fall. But the memoir's exposure could have ruined your plans, too. Those burned papers in your fireplace suggest you saw the manuscript, perhaps took a copy. Mr. Vale, your devotion to Eliza turned to pain when she rejected your pleas to abandon the memoir. The scarf you sent her, so like the murder weapon, and your laudanum purchase raise questions. And Mr. Harcourt, your aunts will tide your inheritance to the memoir's publication a fortune you needed for your debts. Your grand venture, suppressing it would secure your future. Clara's face tightened, but she remained silent, her ring twisting betraying her nerves. Vale sobbed, I loved her. I'd never hurt her. Leonard laughed, a brittle sound. You're barking up the wrong tree, Miss Marple. I was at the pub-G, not the attic. But his eyes darted to Ramsay, and Miss Marple caught the glance. She stepped closer to Ramsay, her voice soft but piercing. The attic tells a story, Mr. Ramsay. You went to Rose Cottage that night, not to discuss, but to demand. Eliza refused to suppress her memoir, didn't she? Her words threatened to expose your plagiarism, your empire's lies. In a moment of rage, you seized the scarf for your own gift, lying there, and tightened it around her throat. The typewriter key was scratched by your ring as she struggled. You took the manuscript, but missed a page, 2 pages, in your haste. The thread from your suit caught as you fled, believing you'd silenced her forever. Ramsay's face crumpled, and he staggered back, his voice a hoarse shout. Enough. I didn't mean to. I only wanted the memoir. She laughed at me, said she'd ruin me. I grabbed the scarf, it was there, on the chair. I didn't think. He sank into his seat, head in hands, as the hall gasped. I just wanted her to stop, he whispered, but she kept talking, mocking me. I lost control. Inspector. Crane stepped forward, his face grim but satisfied. Gerald Ramsay, you're under arrest for the murder of Eliza Harcourt. He signaled to his constables, who led Ramsay away. His shoulders slumped, his charm shattered. The villagers murmured, some shocked, others nodding, as if they'd suspected all along. Miss Marple sat, her hands folded, her expression serene. Clara stared at her notebook. Vale wept silently, and Leonard exhaled, his relief palpable. Mrs. Clement, flustered, called for calm, but the hall buzzed with the weight of the confession. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to a village scandal, years ago, where a merchant's lies were undone by a single ledger entry. Ramsay's desperation, she knew, had been his undoing. His ring and thread the ledger of his crime. As the crowd dispersed, Miss Marple remained, her eyes on the fading light through the hall's windows. The truth had emerged, as it always did, from the careless traces left behind. People, she murmured, her voice lost in the hum of the village, are so very fragile when their secrets are laid bare. Chapter 12. The village restored, the soft light of dawn crept over St. Mary Mead, painting the thatched roofs and hedgerows with a gentle glow that seemed to promise renewal. The village, though still whispering of Eliza Harcourt's murder, had begun to settle back into its familiar rhythms, the milkman's cart rattling along the lane, the church bell tolling for morning service, the scent of fresh bread wafting from the bakery. Miss Jane Marple sat by her parlor window, her knitting needles clicking steadily, a new scarf taking shape in her hands. The confession of Gerald Ramsay the previous evening had unraveled the mystery, yet the echoes of the crime lingered, like a melody that refuses to fade. Miss Marple, her mind as sharp as ever, reflected on the threads that had woven the truth, her eyes tracing the quiet lanes where secrets had briefly disrupted the village's peace. The arrest of Ramsay had sent ripples through St. Mary Mead, stirring both relief and curiosity. The villagers, gathered at the tea shop or the Red Lion, recounted the drama of the village hall, marveling at how Miss Marple's gentle probing had cracked open a publisher's polished facade. It was that scarf, wasn't it? Miss Hartnell, the tea shop owner, had said to her customers, her flour-dusted hands waving. His own gift used to strangle her. Who'd have thought it? But Miss Marple, sipping her tea in the corner, knew it was not the scarf alone, but the smaller clues, the scratched typewriter key, the navy thread, the memoir's pages that had betrayed Ramsay's desperation. With Ramsay in custody, the fate of Eliza's memoir became the village's new obsession. The single page Miss Marple had found, accusing a man of building his empire on stolen words, was published in a London literary magazine, a fragment of truth that sent shockwaves through the publishing world. Ramsay's firm, already teetering, collapsed under the weight of the revelation, its investors fleeing as whispers of plagiarism spread. Miss Marple, reading the news in her morning paper, noted the irony. Eliza's words, though silenced in life, had found their voice in death, just as she'd intended. Clara Dunham, freed from suspicion, left St. Mary Mead the day after the confession, her severe bob and sharp eyes seen no more at the guest house. Mrs. Grayson, the guest housekeeper, told Miss Marple that Clara had secured funding for her own publishing venture, using the scandal to attract investors eager for a fresh start. Ambitious as ever, Mrs. Grayson said, shaking her head. Burned those papers to cover her tracks, I reckon, but she's off to make her mark. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts drifting to a young seamstress she'd known, whose ambition had led her to cut corners, but never to crime. Clara, she felt, would thrive, her secrets safely buried in the ashes of her fireplace. Timothy Vale, too, had vanished from the village, his rented room above the post office empty, save for a worn copy of The Velvet Mask. Mrs. Muggleton, the postmistress, reported that he'd left for London, his eyes still red from tears, but his obsessions seemingly dulled. He said he'd never read another book, she told Miss Marple, her voice tinged with pity. Said Mrs. Harcourt was his last muse. Miss Marple, recalling his laudanum purchase and fervent letters, hoped the city would offer him peace, though she knew obsession, like a stubborn weed, often grew back. Leonard Harcourt remained in St. Mary Mead, his flashy watch, an easy charm tempered by the loss of his aunt's fortune. The wills conditioned that the memoir be published had secured the estate for a literary charity, leaving Leonard with only a modest stipend. Miss Marple saw him at the church, his suit less pristine, his demeanor subdued. He's looking for work, Mrs. Clement confided, passing Miss Marple a hymn book. Says he'll start anew, maybe in trade. The scandals humbled him, I think. Miss Marple smiled, thinking of a prodigal nephew in the village, years ago, who'd learned honesty after squandering his chances. Leonard, she hoped, might yet find his way. As the days passed, St. Mary Mead reclaimed its tranquility, the murder becoming a tale to be told over tea or by the fire. Miss Marple, knitting by her window, watched the village settle, her needles crafting a scarf of soft blue walnut silk, she thought, for silk had proved too treacherous. Cherry, her maid, bustled in with a tray, her chatter full of the latest gossip. They're saying Mr. Ramsay's confessed to everything, miss, she said, setting down a teapot. Told the police he only meant to scare her, but she fought back, and he panicked. All for that book. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on the village green, where children played and the postman cycled by. Fear makes fools of us all, Cherry, she said softly. Mr. Ramsay thought he could silence the truth, but truth has a way of slipping through, like light through a crack. Cherry paused, her hands on her hips. You saw it all along, didn't you, miss? The scarf, the ring, that thread, how do you do it? Miss Marple's needles clicked, her smile serene. I only watch, Cherry, and listen. People are like my knitting, full of patterns, if you know where to look. A dropped stitch, a tangled thread, they always tell a story. She glanced at the scarf in her hands. It's rose, neat and even. And now, perhaps, I'll finish this in peace. The village, bathed in morning light, seemed to nod in agreement, its secrets laid bare, its harmony restored. Miss Marple's thoughts, though, were already wandering, ready for the next puzzle that St. Mary Mead might offer. People, she murmured, her eyes on the quiet lanes, are so very predictable. But their stories never cease to surprise.